class and a wonderful month, and those who stayed over for the whole month have had more and more time to saturate themselves with the new language that comes from new thinking. It takes time to a transformation from a lifetime, or in fact the ages of thinking based upon the senses, and the longer one is in the atmosphere where all people talk that language. The books are for it, and so is the course, but the longer one can stay, the better it is. We have tremendously enjoyed this month's class, Leo and I, and looking forward next year to perhaps, we want to keep it down. We do not want large classes ever. We want only these advanced students, and gradually, as Leo said yesterday, I will not have time for the large class. I will only have time for the advanced students to make teachers of it. Things are happening in relation to this course itself. Things are happening all over the world. We're hearing from here and there and the other. We heard from New York this morning in relation to it. Word of mouth is the only way we use. We know no commercial way, no advertising, never will. Only word of mouth, passing on from one who is ready for it to another who is ready for it. And no one, no student, should ever go out to the highways and byways, they say, and compel them to come in. You cannot convert a man from one belief to another unless he has knowledge of it. And the knowledge must come first, and must come from the man himself. Desire must be there. Therefore, the only way to spread this knowledge among people is to live it. And they'll ask you, what have you got that I haven't got? And where did you get it? I want it. And they will see it. And they do see it. And many of them say, if you would like to know, I'll tell you. They lend them or something of the course. And they come back for more. Then they write us and want it. We have some marvelous letters coming practically in every mail from the far quarters of the globe where it is already penetrated and is still penetrating. One woman who came from South Africa without even letting us know she was coming to see us in New York before we came here. Not from the course, but just from the man who tapped, and has had everything since. We weren't in New York. We were in California. She waited a whole month for us to get back, and then stayed with us a month. She'd come back again. She went to England, and is here at the house of one of our close students, an Episcopal minister, Episcopal clergyman who is a close student of ours. She'll be here shortly, and then going to England and back to South Africa. Spreading it there. We have a very large group in South Africa because of that, and because of in fact, one of her students came here in the first class, and Miss Zachariah was here. She knows him. And the group in New Zealand, they cannot get money out of New Zealand for even books unless they're educational or religious, and then they have to apply to Parliament to get them out. They have made an application to Parliament to get our whole course and our books there based upon an educational motive. And educational books can be allowed in, and a certain amount of money can be allowed to be sent out, but only by an act of the New Zealand Parliament. That application is in now. So the group, the few courses that are in New Zealand, with 20 and 30 and 40 in the group studying one course. You see how it's got to spread, how many people really are really ready for it. Now last week, the whole trend of our questions was in the direction of cutting out experiment, of living a life, a cosmic life, which stems from the mind instead of from the senses of the body. For the purpose of conceiving an idea from the mind, conceiving it clearly and giving the body form in time and space, in the orderliness of the law, such as an oak tree will grow from its seed in an orderly way, without experiment. The cosmic man will not experiment. He will have no need for experiment. Experimental research in any way whatsoever will be based upon knowing. The engineer designs his bridges on his drawing board. He has, to a certain extent, to a large extent, his profession has reduced itself to an exact science, where he has tables of stresses and strains and various principles by means of which he can draw upon the drawing board the entire concept which is in his mind. And with mathematics, he can determine the specifications for steel and various other stresses and strains of the material he uses. The chemist cannot do that. He goes into the laboratory and experiments and experiments. Each experiment may land him much farther than he was before. For instance, the experiments with coal have brought out hundreds of derivatives, hundreds of attributes, coal and coal oil, purely from an experimental basis. But everything that has been produced that way could have been produced on the drawing board, could have been produced without that experiment. Every experiment in high explosives could have been produced in the same way, without blowing people's heads off. My good friend Hudson Maxim has a hand blown off from experimenting while he was trying to make smokeless powder. If you look at his portrait down there, you'll see one gloved hand. That hand is blown off. It's his left hand, fortunately, because he would have had to overcome the difficulty of becoming left-handed instead of right-handed in order to play tennis with me while I was painting his portrait. Well, there was a man, though, that lived from the mind. He never went into the laboratory to do anything until he thought he knew all about it. But then when he thought he knew all about it, he went beyond that which he knew and got into the experimental stage. That's why he blew his hand off. But he's one of the most vital men I've ever known, and he attributes the vitality of his body to the vitality of his mind, to the fact that he's living from the mind rather than from the senses. We often talked about that, about the senility of older people who lived purely from the senses, and their brains became tired and fatigued. Their bodies became depolarized. Senility and impotence set in because of living with the senses, living only from the senses, being dominated by the body rather than dominated by the mind. The whole purpose of this course is to make that transition, knowingly, from domination of the body in one's action by the senses to a mental one. To conceive and then create that conception, give a body to it to the extent of the conception. If one cannot conceive the whole thing, that part which he conceives, such as the motive that a musical genius will have for a symphony, he may have only the motive, that concept, and the motive runs in his mind over and over, but he perfects that motive. Then he goes and talks to God about it again. and the motive grows. Goes back to the seed, and the motive grows in an orderly manner and never departs from its rhythm, the interpretation of the rhythm of that motive that comes to him from the heartbeat of the universe. First, no heartbeat, no thinking, stop thinking. Try to get out of the habit of thinking, because one does much damage. Although I myself urged putting up the word think all over the world in the International Business Machines during my teachings there, it was a good thing to do at that time. It's a good thing to do with people at that stage without being able to explain further. Yes, think. Think of the things you do before you do them. Think, yes. But stop thinking in order to know what you want to think about. And the greatest thing in the world to do is to be able to learn to stop thinking until you know what you're thinking about. The deep well of still water contains all of the elements of still water, but it does nothing until it's set in motion. Pump it out and set it in motion, and it will do things. It will perform work, do many other things. To pump it out, set it in motion. A deep well of water. The mind, that's what should be, a deep well of still water. The electrical pump that we call our thought waves is inserted into that deep well and extended from it in our ways of thinking. But we should not extend or try to extend that which we do not know, because as soon as we do, we find ourselves depending not upon the deep well of water, which is the fulcrum of our existence, but our memories stored upon our brains. Memories of experiences, memories of experiments, memories of all sorts of things impressed upon the brain. And the brain merely is a storehouse of memories, of senses, impressed upon them by the eyes seeing something and photographing it there, the body feeling something, photographing that memory upon the brain, until we have a vast storehouse of memories of observations of the senses, photographed upon the brain, and then instead of really thinking or knowing and thinking a concept, we get to a point where our concept is, no matter how simple it is, to stick to it and go back to God for more, but we forget it. We stop talking to God about it, and then we think we're thinking when we're really only electrically sensing by pulling out from our brains the memories that are there, and we go on and on and on, wasting time, no matter what it is, in the chemical laboratory, in the painting of a picture, the writing of a story, the writing of a musical composition, building up, or synthesizing something out of a vast accumulation of material that the senses have told us about and wound it up in there. An illustrator whom I know cuts everything he can see out of the magazine, whether it's advertising or not, a pretty woman here and a pretty one there, and a stove here and something else, and then he catalogs it as an integer catalog: stove, blondes, brunettes, nudes, foliage, mountains, things. They're all cataloged in his inventory, and he has a story to illustrate, give it to him, and he looks up that thing up, gets all those things out from his files, lays the whole thing around them on tables to make his illustrations. Now that's an excellent example of working from the senses. And when he gets through with that work, there's nothing in it but a synthesis, a plagiarism by wholesale of other people's thoughts and ideas.